All right, you Herle Burly-ites, we're back with another episode, another Economics-palooza episode with our special guests, Amanda Lang and Kevin Carmichael. Amanda is my old friend from Saskatchewan, another Saskatchewan expat, but she's famous. She's the host of Taking Stock, a weekly business news program on CTV, BNN, Bloomberg, and CP24. Previously, she was the host of Bloomberg North. She's been at the CBC. She's been at BNN. She's a political economist of the best kind in Canada. Kevin Carmichael works now as the Economics Columnist and Editor-at-Large at The Logic, which if you're not reading The Logic, you're not learning enough about the Canadian economy. It is a new source of business news coverage that is just fantastic. And Kevin is one of the leading people there, having previously been at the Financial Post, the Globe and Mail, any other number of places that you can possibly name. We're going to run through Canada-US trade issues today and the state of the Canadian economy today, and by gosh, that ought to be enough for you. So, Kevin, you're in Montreal?
I'm in Montreal.
Kevin,
but New Brunswick, David, I just want to say, you and Amanda are from Saskatchewan. I feel some kinship given New Brunswick's the other pass-through province in the country, right? So I always had a connection with people from Saskatchewan. We sort of understood each other automatically.
Okay.
Yeah. What part of New Brunswick are you from?
McCain territory, Carleton County, one of the smattering of villages around Florenceville.
Nice.
Don't make me get into
nice.
it though, David. You just it'll take 5 minutes for me to explain to you and everyone else out there where exactly I'm from. A rural route, let's say.
Right. Well, I think that's true of me as well. I won't bother to get into it. Right now. But the real reason I wanted to ask you, you're in Montreal. Are you getting a shitload of snow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice though. Like shitload, yes, but a gentle shitload. Can you put it that way? It's kind of lovely.
It's beautiful, but we've had up here at the cottage, we've had like a foot of snow in the last 24 hours. It's amazing. That's why I'm wearing my signed David Letterman sweatshirt here, because it's a true wintry day. Toronto, Amanda, any snow in Toronto?
Snowless at the moment. We've had little tiny flakes, but I'm envious actually of you folks up north and in Montreal who are seeing real snow, because that's what we over shoppers live for. All those cans we keep in our cupboards and all of the frozen food, where our families are like, what is this for? It's for that. It's for a foot of snow unexpectedly. So congrats.
Toronto doesn't have winter.
Oh, well, now it has its own version, but I agree. It's not as fun as if it's going to be cold, you should have snow, in my view.
Yeah.
May as well.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So let's get into it. Before we get into the sort of the Trump-Trudeau machinations, there's just some basics I want to understand. So apparently we have a trade surplus with the United States of about $100 billion. Is that normal? Amanda?
I mean, normal. It is in the sense that it fluctuates from time to time. First of all, we export a lot of energy to the U.S., of course. So that's where a lot of our trade surplus would come. I think it's interesting because over the many years I've been doing a television program, I've really shrunk from reporting on the trade deficit. And what I would say to producers is, unless you can explain to me in one sentence why this matters, I don't know. I actually can't really get my head around it. Never could. And part of the reason for that is it's not what Donald Trump would portray it as sort of a be all and end all measurement of the health of your trade relationship. It just isn't, because you have to balance it against the current account balance. And it's I know Kevin probably understands it intimately, but when I look at it, I'm like, I don't know. Over time, maybe it matters, but it doesn't really seem to matter that much. Certainly not in the way it's being portrayed. So yeah, we have a surplus right now. We have a deficit in some sectors. We have a surplus in some sectors. I think we put too much emphasis on it at our peril, but go to Kevin for the explanation of what it is, because I've always been at a loss.
Excellent. Kevin, what is it? Has it been growing?
Look, I don't think we should get bogged down in the trade deficit either. I'm with Amanda. I basically ignore it now. There are new trade deficit or new trade numbers out this morning, actually, and there's actually a deficit at the moment, but I don't know what that really means. It's could mean one of the auto plants shuttered for a few weeks, so that threw everything off. It could mean they were adjusting things in the oil sands, so that threw things off. So there's just so much commerce going back and forth between the two countries. They're really, really interconnected, and yeah, I don't find the trade deficit particularly meaningful anymore either.
But hasn't it become incredibly meaningful politically? Because the president of the United States seems to think that we're ripping him off to the tune of $100 billion.
Yeah, he might, or he might be practicing the art of the deal and using that as leverage to achieve other things, which is another reason I don't want to get too bogged down in a conversation about the actual trade data either, because I think it's a card he's thrown on the table. It's his opening bid, right? And then sure, yeah, he can find some data out there that'll say that there's a massive deficit with Canada, and it's, as a result, the U.S. is being ripped off, but it's a pretty superficial read of things for the reasons we've just discussed. And yeah, for now, I'm just resisting taking the bait myself. I'm in a minority in Canada, maybe, but I'm not going to take the bait yet.
Okay. In Mar-a-Lago, the prime minister apparently told the president that his tariff proposals would devastate the Canadian economy, which prompted the president to remark that maybe we should just be a state then rather than a country. If that was the case, leaving aside that flip remark by the president, what would the impact of Trump's tariffs be on the Canadian economy, and where would we see it?
Do you want me to take that one, or do you want to go, Amanda? I mean, I'm sure we both have thoughts.
Yes.
I'll start. You can come up, and I'll be short. Let me answer that this way. If we did absolutely nothing, it would be devastating. Let's assume that he's serious about 25%. I mean, that would be a killer, just because so much of what we do needs to go to the U.S. for all our companies to be as successful as they are currently. They need the U.S. market to be able to maximize their production, and a 25% tariff would dramatically change the math, dramatically change the competitiveness of everything we're doing here to buyers in the U.S. So yeah, in a static read of the situation, it would be bad. I have more to say. I don't want to go on and on and on. I want to give Amanda a chance to give her first reaction. But yeah, bottom line, a big tariff like that would be devastating. Absolutely.
Well, and let me, of course, Kevin's right about this, as is about everything. What I would say is, I would take it in a different direction. And I don't want to come across like I'm an ostrich here, but I think there's been a gross overreaction to a tweet. Can we still call it that? On social media. And I actually have been, my reaction from the get-go was to our esteemed politicians, everybody sit down. This panic. And the reason why that's important, David, is, and I get it, everybody's playing to the galleries, and our politicians want to be seen to be doing something, and they're competing with each other to be doing more on this thing that hasn't happened. It may never happen. It may just be a shot across the bow of, you guys better be ready to negotiate 2026. The deal is up for renegotiation. We're going to play hardball, et cetera, et cetera. Back channel this stuff. The embarrassment of our prime minister flying down to Mar-a-Lago without even an appointment, didn't even know if dinner was happening. How I would walk out of that date. That's embarrassing. And the reason why I care about that, and I'm curious to know Kevin's thoughts, we saw what the first Trump administration and the uncertainty did to business investment. Businesses hoarded cash. And right now, Canadian businesses have to be, at the very least, paying lawyers and accountants to review their contracts to make sure that if we have tariffs and countervailing duties, their contracts are okay, and that everything in their agreements will still work if suddenly they have to pass through costs. Things like that have real costs to our businesses and the economy. So I would say if our politicians just calm down a little bit, our businesses might be able to calm down too and feel more confident.
Well, yeah, on this calm down thing, well, wait a second. Before you pat each other on the back about this calm down thing, doesn't Trump 2.0 feel different than Trump 1.0? And doesn't it seem like he's put more thought into how he wants to approach this, and that he seems more determined to achieve what he wants to achieve and not be sidelined by people that are going to try to convince him out of things? He hasn't surrounded himself with a single person that will try to convince him to change his mind about anything. You start, Kevin.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. They're far better prepared than they were last time. We're seeing that now. I mean, go back to Trump 1, he was clearly surprised that he won the election, right? So they weren't ready to go. Now they are. And he's doing what Trump does, owning the news cycle day to day. That's, I think, explains all the wacky cabinet announcements, sort of meeting out one or two a day, keep everybody freaked out and engaged and paying attention to him and forgetting that there's actually still a president in the White House making policy, pardoning his son, doing, arguably crazy stuff that would be top of the news cycle at any other moment. And I think this, the tariff tweet, I think fits that. But they do have a different approach to tariffs this time. I think, they clearly see that as a way to raise some revenue. Trump's a tariff guy. Last time he used it the tariff policy was mostly about, attacking global antagonists, real or imagined, to show he's tough, that sort of thing. But this time they have a clearer thinking about it. Whether that thinking makes sense or not is another conversation, but they clearly want to use that as a way to raise revenue. And I think Canada needs to absorb that and think about that. But I'm totally with Amanda. Like, the mistake the political class has made so far is taking the bait, running around, freaking out, adding to the anxiety level over this. The business community is going to freak out anyway. We saw that last time. Business investment basically froze during the duration of the NAFTA negotiations because everybody's business strategies and plans are so tied up in selling the U.S., they were just stopped doing anything. They didn't know what to do without access to that market. I kind of hope this time we learn from that and you certainly do what you need to do to keep those channels open, but shift to some second strategies, some plan Bs and Cs to say, okay, if the worst happens, maybe there's some things we can do here at home or elsewhere to offset the negative outcomes of pick your number for tariffs, whether it's 25, 10, 15, whatever. But that's where I think we need to be focused. I would have preferred the Canadian politicians to just take a breath and say, okay, we're going to start to do some strategies to get ready for this. But we're not going to run around and go down to take a 50-50 shot at having dinner with the president when he beckons. These kinds of things, I think, is a huge mistake.
And let's not forget throwing Mexico right under the bus for no reason, other than maybe we have some kind of belated angst over the fact that they threw us under the bus in the last round of negotiations. Maybe we're mad. I don't know. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. We have a continental agreement that has served us all well. It's been patchy. And by the way, David, I think if anybody wants to really understand Trump's real trade policy. Now, what Trump does and what plays out, of course, is totally different. But the underlying trade policy is coming from Rob Lighthizer. He wrote a book. Go read it. It's super clear. It is a worldview that, by the way, the Biden administration has not particularly strayed from. It's a reintroduction of industrial policy. Our governments have gone that way too. It's a new world where globalization and free trade is kind of not the shiny object anymore. We do have to adapt to that, and we are. We've seen our governments put tens of billions into, one-off bets, some of which are now going tits up. So I would just say the overreaction doesn't really serve us well.
But the Biden government, the Biden administration talked, Amanda, about friendshoring. So
Sure.
they envisioned a world in which we were part of it, right?
Yeah.
Trump is America first, right? And that means we're on the outside looking in. And I mean, I think that Kevin raised this really interesting point, which is, what do we do if this isn't a negotiation? Like, we've assumed it's a negotiation. He puts this on the table, then we put helicopters on the border, and we raise our defense spending, and we do all kinds of things, and he drops the tariffs. But what if it's not a negotiation? Like, you started off by saying these tariffs would be devastating. What if this is not a negotiation? What if this is his budget plan?
The thing to
Amanda.
remember, David, is that we have a reaction, but so do many U.S. states, if not all of them, their governors their business leaders also have a strong reaction, because the part two of that, does it affect Canada, is does it affect the U.S.? And 100% it affects the U.S. I mean, first of all, there's the countervailing tariffs that we might impose. So that would be immediate. And we did, we saw that with steel and aluminum. We can react to these things. But the consequences economically, of course, of tariffs are enormous and well understood. And so I think the internal pressure on the Trump administration not to do something that damaging to the U.S. economy is what we can rely on. And by the way, that we have those relationships. I mean, we do have a team in Ottawa that did form relationships with many of not just the trade negotiators, but also governors, political leaders, business leaders who can be our ally in this. And
that's the strategy we did last time.
Yep.
That was the build alliances among all the economic and political interests in the United States and encircle Trump. But Kevin, I got a feeling that he cares less this time what Gretchen Whitmer thinks about the tariffs than he did last time. I don't know that strategy is going to work with him.
He might not care about what Gretchen Whitmer has to say, but again, I agree with Amanda on this one too. I mean, he will care, or at least be interested, or take meetings with the titans of industry who have a stake in trade with Canada, who don't like what losing access to their Canadian suppliers means to their profit margins. And we talk about tariffs as if there's something that punish people outside the U.S. Yeah, they do, obviously, to a great extent, but they also will end up punishing Americans too. I mean, this is a consumption tax.
But it's an invisible tax. It's brilliant. It's an invisible tax.
It's an invisible tax, depending on how much of it each side of the first part of the transaction decides to absorb, and profit margins on both sides of the border are decent to really good. So companies could decide to absorb some of this, at least for the short term,
I wouldn't count on
to
it,
see how things go. So it might not be a noticeable effect right away. Obviously, a longer term effect, the longer these things stay in place. But again, to the chorus from Amanda and me, another reason not to overreact. But I just will just wrap up this thought just by emphasizing that, the best allies of Canada are the companies in the U.S. that work with Canadian companies, and let them explain to the Trump administration why tariffs are a bad idea, and let them argue it down. We should be conserving our energy and resources and time into doing stuff that we can control here at home. And my God, there are so many things we could do. David be sitting down yesterday afternoon to think about what I might be able to add to this conversation, depending on how it goes. I started a list. I got to 12, and I hadn't even got to inflation or housing or any of these things. So there are so many things we could just do here that we can control, that if they wouldn't entirely, or if they they might not outweigh the effects of a worst case tariff situation in the U.S., but they certainly would offset a significant amount of that blow that would come from any sort of trade war with the United States.
And just before you shift gears, one of those things could be something like not trying to pass Bill 282, which I don't know if you've talked about it before, but it's a heinous bill that the Senate is, God bless them, holding up, but that any day could get royal assent, which will make it illegal to put our supply management on the table in trade negotiations, including in NAFTA. So that's just a poke in the eye. The Europeans hate it. The UK walked away from a new trade deal with us. The US will have the same reaction. It's just a foolish thing to do. Why are we doing it? Because Quebec farmers are a powerful lobby is the only answer that I can really understand on that one. So there are things we could do, and that includes not shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah. Well, my favorite is the government talks a lot about us having a free trade agreement with every G7 country. Well, there's actually one we don't have a free trade agreement with. That's Canada. We don't have free movement of goods and services in our own country. That's the lowest.
You know what, Kevin? You want to talk
basically about on the ground. We could do that tomorrow, and it'd make a big difference.
Probably a colossal understatement to say if consumers were given a choice, they would want to control where and how they spend their hard-earned dollars. Particularly right now. We're all feeling the pinch. Well, as I was on about last week, Consumer choice is now being threatened because real competition in the marketplace is being threatened by a recent federal cabinet order. If you recall, that cabinet order is asking the CRTC to reconsider their interim decision allowing competitors like our presenting sponsor TELUS to leverage the mandate and access wholesale internet services as a new entrant into the Ontario and Quebec marketplace. Who benefits from limiting competition in a marketplace? Well, it ain't the consumer, I can tell you that. So why the heck is the federal cabinet making a decision that makes it harder for consumers to choose? It sure doesn't sound like a decision for the people, does it, Herle Burly-ites? In their original decision, the CRTC said, where an incumbent operates out of territory, it is acting as a new competitor with the potential to disrupt the status quo to the benefit of consumers, to provide new competitive offers and put pressure on all competitors to deliver additional benefits for consumers. That decision was supported by no less an expert than the Competition Bureau. So let me just say it. All those benefits are now at risk because of the cabinet order and the potential reversal of the CRTC decision. Fair competition and the right of all Canadians to choose their internet provider is at risk. That's bigger than just a TELUS thing. I'll have more next week, but if you feel similarly about this, you can make your voice heard right now by signing a petition at change.org/yourinternet, You were talking earlier about shit you're bored of and don't want to talk about, right? Internal trade barriers, free trade in Canada. This has been a top issue as long as I've been alive.
Yep, like productivity.
As long as I've been alive, we've been talking about this, and I haven't seen one significant effort to achieve it. Not one. Obviously, it's not doable.
So here's what I'll say to that. I mean, I'll say two things. One, there's some interesting things happening on the margin, but on the margin. So they're not going to move the needle unless political leaders or business people push them into doing so. But it does feel like it has to come top down. There obviously isn't that pressure from the bottom up to do anything on this. Let me say this, okay? You're right. We've talked about this forever and not done anything. I'm going to say that's because we had a far more lucrative market to focus on all those years, being the U.S. So let's say we've been talking about doing something serious around internal trade for 20 or so years, 30, whatever. Well, that's about the same amount of time that we've got serious about doing global free trade, right? So that's where all the attention went, and probably because that probably suited lots of people. Let's focus on the U.S., let's focus on Europe and Asia, and we don't have to, upset, the guys who are around the corner from my constituency office. So that's great, but that door, it's not closed, but I mean, that opportunity has certainly worn itself out for now. There's not, and if anything, it's going a bit in reverse. The only time in my time paying close attention to the Canadian business scene, so 25-ish years now, the only time we managed to do anything significant, introduce a positive shock via policy, is when we're facing some kind of external threat. You know this, David. I mean, that's what brought about everything that Paul Martin did in the 1990s, because he went out after his first budget and was shocked that the international investing community wasn't impressed. So he came home and did more. Maybe this Trump threat is what we need to get serious on some of these, as Governor Tiff Macklem calls them, own goals. And internal free trade is the biggest of the own goals, like moving the goalie out of the net and just taking practice shots at it. I mean, it's so easy to fix. I don't know why we don't.
You do know why, though. It's that.
Well, I do know why. Yeah.
To me, Kevin, it's exactly the same answer as why housing affordability seems so intractable, where we know what to do. And the answer is the incumbents are benefiting. The incumbents are voting, and therefore politicians don't want to say, here's the answer, because we won't like it. There are too many small business people in every province, union leaders who are doing very well with the lack of free trade. Is same as housing, right? We don't want the value of our homes to go down, so we're not going to build enough houses.
So, Amanda, how much would it compensate for losses in the U.S.? Like, what are the actual potential gains from a Canadian free trade
Well, so I've seen different numbers. I'm sure Kevin has too. Like the number that I like, because it's so tidy, it's almost suspiciously tidy, but came from, I want to say it was the Canadian Chamber, actually, or it might have been the Business Council, forgive me, but that it was basically a wash, that you could get about 3% boost to GDP. The numbers are enormous in terms of job creation, growth. And of course, the real thing that we need to keep in mind is the unknown, right? The potential you unleash from competition, which is what we saw with the FTA and the NAFTA. You do it internally. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say these tariffs go ahead. What levers do we have? I noticed with a smile last night that the Mexican government has imposed a per head tax on cruise ships. Going through Mexico, which I thought was clever. But in any event, one of the things that I thought I knew, since I've been paying attention to these things, is that when Canada gets into a game of trade linkage with the United States, we run out of chips long before they do. So it's not a game we can play. Do we have levers in this fight? Kevin?
I don't want to put myself on the spot, so I'll quote a business professor I spoke to a couple of weeks ago when I put that question to him, and he said, no, we don't have any levers. And one of the reasons we don't have any serious levers at this stage, and why things have changed maybe over the last decade or so, is because the U.S. has become an oil exporter. And like that was one big card we had in our pocket. They needed energy from the rest of the world. It's not as simple as that. I mean, they're set up to receive a lot of the heavy oil from the oil sands. So it would be there would be a cost to cutting off the supply from Canada. But the ultimate point is that. There are 2 points, really, right? The Trump administration has showed us they're willing to eat a certain amount of cost to achieve their larger goals. So that's not something that gets their attention the way it might have gotten the attention of previous administrations. And two, that they can ultimately generate that energy internally. And they're also investing big time. We don't talk about it, and they don't seem to want to talk about it so much on the Republican side, but they're investing big time in renewable energy too, or whatever. So, they're an energy superpower now, and they don't need as much as ours ultimately. So that was the one big card we have. I grew up with people telling me that the Americans are going to come for our water one day. So maybe there's that, but I don't know that we necessarily want to let external forces, external entities tap our water supply just because we want to get out from under a 20% tariff or a 25% tariff. But honestly, beyond that, I don't know that we have much outside capital. I mean, the pension funds, asset managers, Canadian companies, we spend a lot of money in the US. Maybe that's a lever. But outside that, Amanda's going to have a better answer to this, I think. But I admit, because I don't want to come off as too negative, but I don't think we have a lot of leverage. Let me put it this way. I don't think we have as much leverage as we have in the past, and as much leverage as we might think we have.
I totally agree. And I think actually thinking of it in terms of leverage is a mistake because Canada is a teensy tiny country. When I lived in New York for about 5 years, and what I learned was it's not what they think of us, it's that they don't think of us at all. We are not that relevant. We're Sweden. We happen to be tacked on to them. Aren't we lucky? And so I would say, I totally agree. The idea that we would sort of hold our oil hostage, good luck with that. That's just not going to happen. What we do have, though, and I would say the reason why I kind of remain stubbornly optimistic here is we have a long and complicated relationship, and the intertwining of our economies is legitimate. And so just like any long relationship, you think twice before dissolving it, especially if you don't have a prenup. This is not pleasant. And so the pain would be felt on both sides. And that's where, I have this like weird optimism that even the craziest person, when put into a big role, a big office, and exposed to the real information, right? You can put, the person you think is least qualified, they get a Pentagon briefing, and they wake up and they realize they're in a big job. And I think most people rise to that occasion. And I think most people involved in this, when they're presented with the real consequences of this stuff, not shooting your mouth off, not a negotiating tactic, which could be all it is, but actual real consequences of massive tariffs on part of the US economy, which is what it would be, I think you think twice. So that's our best kind of, it's not a lever maybe, but our best defense is the long history. We shouldn't overplay our hand. We did that going into the last trade negotiations. The Canadians came in like, we're going to be just fine and everybody loves us. And Lighthizer et al. Were like, nope, we don't care. We're going to talk to Mexico. Come back when you're serious. We're serious now. And I think that's the attitude we have to have. We're not important, but we do matter.
I've got a thought to add to that, David, because just before we move on to another question, the other thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. economy is on fire, basically at full capacity. And I'm sure, they're Americans. They want to keep growing, so they're going to need some extra capacity to help them do that. And that's that relationship that Amanda just described. So yeah, and that's just to emphasize her point or underline it, and to amplify the point we've been making from the top is that there's not necessarily a need to overreact here. I mean, they don't need us, but we help U.S. business a great deal.
So Amanda, how does a government? I mean, there's a lot of reasons to feel sorry for Trudeau and Freeland, but this is another one. How do you plan in this circumstance? Like, we are still waiting on a fall economic statement, and I don't know what they'll present as forecasts. They probably have to present a range of things or different scenarios. How do you plan in this environment if you're the Canadian government?
Well, I mean, I feel like you're giving them a script here that allows them to fudge their numbers because the big, the boogeyman's out there. I think you stick to your own script. You stick to what you do know. Economists, they do their range, right? They'll do their kind of three scenarios in the actual statement. But we saw, we just got the fiscal monitor. We do get a read on how revenues are matching up to spending. And newsflash, we are spending more than we're taking in for our government. So deficits will increase. There's no question about that. The question is how much, and how much do we hold them to their guardrails, et cetera, et cetera. The government has to plan based on what it knows. It can't actually make wild conjectures and shouldn't. So maybe one of those scenarios is a crazy, 2.5%, 3% contraction in GDP. Maybe. I hope not, because that, we deal with that when you don't forecast ahead and make your plans based on a recession, but you allow that it might happen. And I think that's how they should treat this.
So our sponsor, CN, goes back a long way in Canadian history, as you'd expect, more than a century, in fact. And while the advent of the railroad was, among other things, the glue of Confederation and an immeasurable boost to our nascent economy, it's fair to say that the Indigenous people, who'd already been here thousands of years, did not wholeheartedly welcome it. There were issues, let me put it that way. And in the here and now, consonant with the national mood in both government and business, CN is determined to build and fortify trust and collaboration with the hundreds of Indigenous communities along its thousands of miles of network. The company has just announced an Indigenous Reconciliation Action Plan, devised and shaped by intensive consultations with Indigenous communities and with CN employees who engage with them. The plan outlines concrete steps and measurable commitments over the next 3 years. It is designed to bring about meaningful change. CN believes that can be done through employment programs, through cultural awareness on the part of CN's railroaders, and through a recognition that Indigenous stewardship of our environment is the gold standard. No one has more experience in that regard. No one. CN acknowledges its complex history and relationship with Indigenous people, and that it is for Indigenous people, and Indigenous people alone, to judge when reconciliation is successful. Meanwhile, the company is fully committed to its journey towards genuine reconciliation and ensuring its new action plan gets results. Simple as that, really. Sticking with you, Amanda, the business community stepped right forward and said one of the things we have to do is increase our defense spending. We have to meet our NATO commitments and probably shoot past them. That 2% is a minimum. It's a floor. It's not the ceiling. Other countries are going past that. We've got to be prepared to go to 3. Let's leave all that aside. 2% is $20 billion of government spending annually. That would have to come from either spending cuts or tax increases or higher deficits. And I'm curious about your view on two things. One of which is, what is the nexus between defense spending and our economic trade relationship with the United States? And second of all, do you see any political way that the government could put $20 billion more a year into defense spending in Canada?
So I think it's important. And I actually think renewing our commitment in various ways to our NATO alliance is more important than the signal it sends to the US. So yes, Donald Trump is saying it, but by the way, NATO leadership has been saying it. European leaders have been saying it. Canada should step up. We're part of an important global agreement. It matters, and it matters, I think, more than ever right now to signal that it's real and that it matters because we have a massive aggressive force in the world in the form of Russia. So I would say not a bad thing to, we have this commitment. In terms of the spending, I mean, the reason why folks like the Business Council and others have said we should do it is it is a kind of a sideways industrial policy. You don't have to send all of this down to, giant defense companies in the US. We could actually foster defense spending in Canada. Now, reasonable people can differ about whether we should do that, but we're sending tens of billions to, US and international corporations, multinationals to build EVs and EV battery plants. Why not send some of it to some of our own technological companies in Canada, our own defense companies? It fosters growth. It creates jobs. You may not love it, but it's not, to me, that it all adds up to not a terrible thing. And I think in terms of what's happening in the world, a pretty sellable one politically.
Kevin, you got a thought about that?
Just to echo what Amanda just said, and I think that's where the government is at even. I heard Chrystia Freeland recently sort of use that essentially as justification for not coming out with an immediate sort of plan about how we're going to accelerate our path to that 2% commitment, because she said, they're in the middle of doing work. They need some more time to figure out how to actually make this work. So it does turn into something more of a industrial policy than just, I don't know what, hiring a bunch of soldiers or doing some things that would be less productive. So there does seem to be some serious thinking going on in Washington on how, recognizing that the world has changed and that we do finally have to live up to this commitment. So given that we've decided or that we feel the need to do so, how do we make sure that we actually get some spin-off benefits from that? So that seems to be what's happening. There's this contract that they worked out with Finland. I guess the U.S. is involved too, I think. Maybe I'm misremembering some sort of contract to build icebreakers. Seems like something we could have been doing 15 years ago, but anyway, we're going to do it now. So again,
if we wait long enough, we won't have to do it at all.
I was just thinking that.
Oh, well, that's it too.
We can use canoes.
Maybe that's what Stephen Guilbeault has been arguing. Well, we haven't done it sooner. Anyway, point is that kind of work is in effect. And yeah, David, no, I've heard you say lots of time over the time that I've listened to you that yeah, Canadians don't want to see that kind of spending, don't care about defense spending. I think that's because we're, for the last 30 years, we've been in a zone where, we were immune from all the chaos going on in the world, and it was sort of pressed out on the margins. We didn't have to think about it. We have to think about it now. It's getting closer and closer, right? So I assume that the public mood and the public acceptance for that kind of thing has changed. And I can't see how any government today would have a difficult time selling that. But I think you should pair it, of course, with some kind of program review, with some kind of spending cuts. I mean, we are sort of, the credit card is maxed out. Or if it's not maxed out, I mean, it's getting hard to stomach every time it comes in, right?
Yep.
So to me that's the right way to go about this, right? Recognize that we've got this new commitment that is rushed up to the top of the priority list, and therefore we're going to have to push some of these other things away. Why the current government hasn't done that yet, I don't know. I'm hopeful as a citizen that they're going to come forward with some kind of serious program review and concede that we can't spend on absolutely everything that we've been thinking about for the last 20 years in our various think tanks and whatnot, and get serious and focus on a handful of things, 3 to 5 things that really matter, and spend appropriately on those things, and let a lot of the rest of this stuff go away.
And commit to it, because we have ample evidence. But the most egregious to me is the immigration policy, where if you don't commit, it's a disaster. If you do commit, it can be a quite a thoughtful long-term plan. And now this government is going to have whatever next government happens, is going to have to deal with a drag on our economy. RBC says up to 20 billion in the end with the wash, because of the lack of growth in our population. So things can work if you actually bear down on them, and really mess you up if you go half measure.
November was Financial Literacy Month, Herle Burly-ites, and hopefully the algorithms brought to you important messages about financial literacy all month long. Well, our sponsor, Fidelity Investments Canada, believes these conversations about finances are wonderful, and they should happen all year long, and focus on investment literacy as well. Because getting started with investing early and developing healthy investing habits, especially for the young people of this country, can pay powerful dividends for their standard of living over the long term. So to help high school students and their teachers, Fidelity created Money Gains. For students, it's a series of jargon-free educational videos on investments. And for teachers, it's lesson plans on investments to use in their classrooms. In the era of misinformation, meme stocks, and finfluencers, Fidelity's Money Gains provides access to proper educational information that our young people can count on to learn about investing the proper way. So, Herle Burly-ites, if you know someone who could benefit from this investment literacy educational program, consider www.fidelity.ca/moneygains at any time of the year. Because investment literacy matters, and fostering financially secure, resilient future generations is good public policy. So, the Minister of Finance said that we're in a vibe session, implying that there wasn't really an economic problem, but just that people were feeling bad. Former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz yesterday, I think, said we're in a recession, an actual recession. Which of them is right?
Which of them is right? I guess I'll side with the former governor. And here's the difference, right? Maybe you can think about it like this. Let's put it in the terms of, you're a hockey fan, David. Let's put it in terms of the NHL. So the NHL, as you'll know, went through a phase of adding franchises as a path to growth. Those franchises were weak. But for a while, they helped the front line or the top line just by bringing in, new revenue sources. But these weren't efficient franchises by any means. That's kind of what's going on right now in the Canadian economy. The top line has been floated by the surge in immigration. So we've crowded more and more people in to buy some stuff to kind of keep the general economy afloat. But on an individual basis, on a household basis, for the most part, we're poorer than we were before the pandemic, or we're at least kind of treading water. And so when Stephen Poloz talks about a recession, he's probably talking about that perfect alignment between what economists call per capita consumption, and so on a household basis, consumption is actually down, and that forever has been correlated tightly with a recession. And so the reason we're not in a recession right now is because we have all these other people sort of, again, in personal recessions, but there are enough of them in the larger thing we call the Canadian economy to sort of float the top line. And that's where the vibe session idea falls down to. That's sort of based on old thinking or received wisdom that sort of sees what's going on in the labor market. So the unemployment rate is decent, growth is decent, therefore sentiment should be decent as well. Sentiment isn't strong at the moment, but that's because on an individual level, people don't feel great. They either are trying to catch up to the price level surge over the last few years, or they've only just caught up and still are fresh in their minds about how painful it's been to keep up with keep up with the price of gas, food, etc. So anyway, it's hard. I don't feel I've done a perfect job of explaining the dynamics as I see them. They're complicated, but that's what's going on. And this whole vibe session meme, I think it was a mistake from the get-go. It was an oversimplification of what was going on the ground. Like it's a nice, economics is great at creating maps from aerial views of what's going on. Terrible at describing what's going on the ground. It's terrible at describing the territory. And I think people who've gotten used to looking at things from a macro perspective lost sight of really what's happening with people's lives.
I could not agree more. I mean, this whole notion that it's all in our heads is, and I think probably one that's being regretted inside the walls of finance. Because, and by the way, there's a reason people dislike economists. I don't know if you caught this, but the Bank of Canada just revised all of their, which they do, as they should, but they just revised all of the GDP data going back a few years, and turns out that it wasn't as bad as we thought all the way through the pandemic. What really matters to people is their own circumstance and situation. And I will say this disconnect that we're seeing, that we're talking about, where you see, corporate profit doing fine. We're starting to see top line growth. Restaurants are actually coming back. Maybe they're not as bad as we thought. It doesn't really match up with that affordability problem that remains, right? We still have grocery prices that are double digits above where they were a couple of years ago.
Amanda, Jim Stanford told me on this show just a couple of weeks ago that wage growth had outstripped inflation. That there was no reason to believe that anybody was worse off today than they were 5 years ago.
So those are aggregate numbers. And I guess, again, Kevin might have a more granular view of that. It is true that we have seen wages. And by the way, if you want the glass half full, then you look at household savings. Our household savings rate is wonderful. It's 7%. It was below 3% before the pandemic. So we're saving money. When I say we, I mean wealthy people, relatively speaking, wealthy people. So where I was going with that is that the disconnect in our world is writ large by this affordability problem. And even as, people who don't have an extra dollar have to spend more of their money on things like rent and food, people who do have an extra dollar are making even more because rates went up. So their savings are doing better. Their investments are doing better. We're protecting their house value at all costs. And so it's really bad for the people that it's bad for. It's getting less bad for the middle chunk because rates are softening, and it's great for the wealthy people. And this is exacerbating problems we've had for a while.
Interesting.
Yeah, okay. We're paying the price for putting way too much emphasis on aggregates and averages for probably a few decades, for as long as I've been doing this work, is they just sort of use the averages and aggregates as shorthand for what's going on in the economy. And, it was a mistake then, but it was probably, okay, given that generally speaking, everything was rolling along all right. There was no inflation. So, people weren't doing great, but at least they were getting by, or at least there was no great change in their quality of lives from month to month. The inflation surge changed all of that. To build on some things that Amanda said, no, it's really, you have to get below the surface and see what's happening with various segments of the economy. Rich people have done great. They're wealthier than ever. They're making more money than ever, and they're floating that aggregate on which the proponents of the vibe session are sort of basing their meme or their idea of what's going on. Interestingly, the other people that have done relatively well through all of this is the lowest.
We normally associate Jim Stanford with being a champion of the wealthy, but we'll take.
Well, but so here's where Jim isn't wrong, right? Because the lowest quintile has done particularly well too. in that because of the wage increases that you talked about, like that's real. And someday soon, we might be able to look back at all of this and say, wow, it's kind of worked in the way, or it didn't work. That's the wrong way, but we're going to feel better off because going into think back to pre-COVID, wages were essentially frozen. And one of the big questions that economists were grappling with is like, what's going on? And how are we going to, raise people's standard of living if wages are basically flat forever? Well, the inflationary episode has busted that worry because companies were forced to figure out a way to, because they were desperate for labor to keep up with everything that was going on. Wages have surged. I mean, after the inflation went first, wages are surging to catch up. Wages are still growing. So at some point, and they're always starting to balance out, but we just it hasn't that process hasn't completed itself yet. But at the other end of this, generally speaking, workers are probably going to be a little better off than they were in 2019, but we're not there yet. And the vibe thing is a fallacy ultimately, because people are still feeling shitty right now. In a couple of years, they might feel less shitty, depending on how the Trump tariffs go, of course.
It's worth noting that some of that wage stuff too, Kevin, don't you think, is split along union and non-union? I mean, we've really seen negotiated wage increases have led the way. And P.S., that the lion's share of the employment is public sector. And so that's union negotiated wages. So government workers, but also we've seen private sector wages go up double digits. I would suggest, and I'm not going to claim to have dug into this data, but that there is a tranche of private sector labor that has seen wage increases, but that are lagging inflation. I think the big kind of boosts to these numbers are coming from unionized labor, which is, right. That might be why Jim Stanford likes that data point. It is it's an argument for organized labor.
Yeah.
At the risk of using an aggregate number, wages are generally speaking growing at 4 to 5% across the board. And inflation now, of course, is at 2-ish%. So just do math. So
yes, but we know that for airline pilots, they're up 11%. And for, a guy doing IT work, they might be up, I don't know, 1.5%. I don't know, but it's a bumpy spike. No, and I broke that out relatively recently, Amanda, and you're absolutely right. Like that's another part. That's another reason, or another reason why the Vive session breaks down in a hurry, because you take that aggregate number and 5% is because people in IT have experienced like an 18 or 20% increase in pay, while people at the lower end are around 3, 4, 5%, something like that. So it doesn't. Again, it's another reason. I will go read it. I will go read that, Kevin. I don't know how I missed it. I usually see everything you write.
So hey, regardless of whether it's real or not, every government in Canada is scrambling to try to throw some money at its population to deal with the affordability crisis. Everything from gas tax holidays to checks in the mail to GST holidays, any number of things. Who's doing it right, Amanda?
Globally, I don't know. I mean, I suspect.
I'm talking about in Canada.
So I will say I haven't seen. So where it's money checks being sent, I think it's mistimed. I think it's the wrong approach. We may well have a pretty serious recession in our future, and you might want to wait for your helicopters of cash till then. There is a reason to keep your powder dry.
Right.
So I don't like any of that. The GST holiday is a disaster. I don't know about you, but I immediately thought of the poor retailers who are now going to have arguments at the till with customers about whether this thing is tax-free or that thing. So that's fun. And they have to administer it, and they have to apply for it and get it back. And what a nightmare. Anyway, that the impulse to help, of course, is genuine. There are things I wish the government would do. And Kevin has written brilliantly about this very recently, but there are kind of more thoughtful, longer term plays here that improve our productivity, that just spend on infrastructure, for heaven's sakes. Let people get to work faster because infrastructure works. Things that make us more efficient. It doesn't help. So then I would say, the most vulnerable among us, then we can actually target there. Make sure food banks have enough food for people. Increase disability checks so people can actually pay the average current rent out there. Send more money to the most vulnerable people.
But it isn't only the most vulnerable who are grumpy.
I know, but
they may need it the most, but everybody's grumpy. And these politicians are trying to avoid getting lynched.
The idea that seniors and students need a $250 check and that somehow that's going to make a difference, to me, is farcical. That's just you know what? That's just playing to the crowd, and I don't think anybody should govern that way.
Kevin, you got a smart idea for dealing with the affordability crisis?
Yeah, boost economic growth. Keep those wages rising. Like, make sure everybody beyond the tech sector gets a raise, and that's why I dislike the helicopter money.
That is not going to move the poll numbers next month, Kevin. I'm just going to tell you that it's not going to move the poll numbers next month.
Yeah, well, okay. I was tempted to throw this question back at you because I'll say two things.
Are we allowed to do that? Oh my God.
I think, why not? I mean, anyway, why don't you come in on this after I say a couple of things, David, because I'm actually very curious what you think about those policies too. So I will say one thing. No, I'll say two things. First thing, bad policy. If we have that sort of fiscal room, we should be using it to do things that'll boost long-term growth. We have this productivity crisis that is astonishing. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, we've rolled our eyes at productivity for a long time. Fair enough. When it was just sort of trundling along, now it's gone subterranean, and that's just not right. You just can't build a successful economy and generate wealth when, productivity is in reverse. That should be a national emergency, like the Bank of Canada tried to warn us it is 9 months ago. So that's where governments, I think, should be focusing all their attention. Now, I don't know what to make of this personally, but I'll put it on the table for people to think about. I do think that at least the finance minister is operating at a level that's pretty far above what we might be thinking about day to day when we're going to the grocery store or filling up gas, worrying about the cost of living. She's worried about Western democracy. And I know she's worried about polarization and people becoming so disenchanted that they're going to give up on politics. This
is why she shouldn't be the finance minister, by the way.
Sorry?
This is why she shouldn't be the finance minister.
Well, we could have that discussion too. But she does look at the world that way. And she does worry that people are becoming disgruntled, disenchanted to the point that they are ready to turn their backs on democracy and get behind cults of personality. So this measure in her mind, or she might be able to make an argument for things like this, keeping people calmed down, or at least nothing. They might feel like nothing else is working, but at least that over the holidays they can talk about how they got a break on their Christmas tree, or they can expect $200 in the new year or something like that. That might be part of her thinking. Whether it's legitimate, I don't really know, but it might, if we want to be fair, it might be factoring into the way she's thinking about policy. You'll tell me that no, it's really about trying to get those poll numbers up a bit, and that's probably the right way. But I just wanted to, in all fairness, put that out there for people to think about. Right.
And I don't think those are illegitimate things to be thinking about. And I think they're very good things for the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada to be thinking about. But she's got two jobs, and I've always thought that there isn't enough bandwidth in any one person to do both of those jobs properly. That's all I'm saying when I say she should be the finance minister.
Although, as I listen to Kevin, I'm reminded of the late Jim Flaherty, who late in his tenure and what turned out to be late in his life was changing his mind about things like income splitting. And I took the opportunity to say, well, how about that old cut to the GST? Let's agree now that was a mistake. And he said, you know what, Amanda? Every day people have more money in their jeans, and every day I feel good about that. And I think that's kind of what Kevin's saying. There's value in that, and you can slice and dice, and economists will have a different answer. people like money in their jeans. There's no question about it.
For sure.
Economists do a bad job at working power and into their modeling and just the cost of just making sure democracy or government sort of works, and forget about the incentives that whoever's in power at any given time needs to internalize to be able to keep doing what they're doing.
Yep.
So it's possible that these dollops of helicopter money are part of that. Again, if we want to be fair, is it good policy? Ultimately, no. Counterfactual, if this government had worked harder on administration, I guess I mean to say, and shown us that all this money that they're pumping into the economy was actually having a real effect, that they took more time to make sure things were working, showed us evidence of things working, rather than just continually announcement after announcement after announcement. Maybe the helicopter money wouldn't be necessary. Maybe the GST holidays wouldn't be necessary. But here we are, and these guys feel like they need to do something for their own, probably some combination of their own survival and maybe to keep people from totally losing faith in what members of parliament are trying to do.
None of it's working. None of it's working because people may not know very much about economics, but they can suss out motive. And if people thought that these gestures were taken out of genuine concern about their ability to afford Christmas, they would probably like it and support it. But they suspect it has almost everything to do with the government's polling numbers, and therefore they hate it.
I think that's the difference between what the federal government's doing and what the Ontario government's doing. They can look at the Ontario government and they're not unpopular. And they can look at the Ontario government and see a fiscal situation that looks pretty good, frankly. Like there's a lot of money being spent on capital, so it's not like they're ignoring the productivity problem or the infrastructure problem. They're spending a lot of money on that. I, again, might argue that if you have fiscal room to give everybody a $200 check, maybe you should just keep pushing on capital spending, given where we are. But the budget is basically balanced. So Doug Ford's government has the optionality to do or to enact a policy like that that's not going to really hurt the economy or the fiscal balance in any particular way. The federal government's not in that situation. It looks pretty clear that the finance minister, and let's not forget, after making a pretty big show about how she's serious this time and Canada's fiscal guardrails were actually an advantage going into a chaotic period that we're going into. And don't we look good against the US, which has this ridiculous deficit? We just have a smallish deficit. And I was in Washington and watched her tell a room full of people that, this is, people are taking notice. Canada has the Canadian dollar is turning into something of a reserve currency, a safe haven for people. Look, our interest rates are lower than the US interest rates because I have my fiscal guardrails. Well, really? Now she's about to blow them. That's not going to necessarily...
What's a weaker term for guardrails? I mean, guardrails were themselves a downgrade.
Well, look, there's an argument at this stage that maybe you should just, set some guardrails that are actually achievable given the times we're in. The European Union has what are their guardrails? A deficit of 3%, right, Amanda?
Yeah.
We could do that and still look good against the US and then use that fiscal room if we do that, we should use that fiscal room not to spend on stupid stuff like GST holidays. We need to use that fiscal room to do things that'll, give us a chance to generate more economic growth. Senator Clément Gignac has a plan that he's circulated. I think I saw it on LinkedIn is where I ran across it. I talked to him a bit about it. He's like, throw away the fiscal guardrails, and do basically, David, this will bring back memories, basically an infrastructure plan based on climate change adaptation. I haven't thought it all the way through to know if that to have my own thoughts of whether that's the best course. It's not a bad course. I mean, we've kind of forgotten about climate change this year, it feels like. We certainly realize in the debate over carbon tax that on an individual level, none of us are really enthusiastic enough to get up and create a critical mass to move the needle there. So maybe government's going to have to do it. Maybe Joe Biden was right, and the only way to make a difference is to blow up your fiscal balance and just spend and spend and spend until you do something that makes a difference. So maybe the senator's on to something there. I'm not sure, but
I just want to say that, like, I think we can all agree this current federal government has done a series of things that were designed to be politically attractive that backfired, that didn't get them what they wanted, including backtracking on their own carbon policy, which should have been the centerpiece of their legacy. That should have been the thing they could point to and say that, and maybe lifting children out of poverty, not a bad thing that they did right out of the gate. But the carbon policy should have been the thing they said, look, we're ahead in the world, we're proud of this. Instead, they've backtracked it and weakened it to the point, and it didn't get them anywhere. Politically, people aren't prepared, and maybe it's just that's the I mean, you would probably have a better answer to that than I could, David, but maybe there's nothing they can do at this stage that will make them popular. And then I would say, if that's the case, guys, do what's right. If it's not gonna win you anything at the ballot box or the polls, just do what you believe in. And they don't seem to have that motivation, which is frustrating.
The appetite for sacrifice to reduce GHG emissions right now is zero, right? Absolutely. And in fact, the government's focus on climate is convincing Canadians that they don't care about affordability, right? Because it's considered that you can't care about both at the same time. That's where the climate issue is at.
They lost control of the debate. The minute they let it be called a tax tied to affordability, they lost control of the vision. There's a vision, if you, to Kevin's point, like if you actually just re-immerse yourself in the facts, the data. Michael Byers has a great book about that. You will actually wonder why we talk about anything else. How do we get up in the morning and talk about anything but climate? Because it's an emergency. We're in the middle of it. Nothing else is going to matter at some point. But we don't. We back burner it. We move on to other things, and we need leaders with vision on this stuff. And they're
going to get thrown out of office, Amanda. Those leaders with vision, because I mean, what I learned working with Paul in the 1990s. Is that people won't sacrifice until the wolf is right at the door. Yep. Right at the door. They don't sacrifice for an apprehended problem. Paul Martin was not the first finance minister that tried to make cuts to government spending. All the previous ones had gotten beaten back politically, right?
But look at how he's remembered.
But he didn't, because it was a crisis at that time. Yep. That's money. You can deal with that. By the time people see climate change enough to act, it will be far, far too late to do anything about it.
It already is in some way.
Yes.
I mean, I used to call this the let the polar bears drown principle, right? We all care about polar bears. We want them to survive. Oh, it's going to cost me $8 this month. Let them drown. Yeah. Too many polar bears. We don't like it when it hits us personally.
So Jasper presumably would it be similar to that scenario, Amanda? I would think like that's something terrible that got people's attention.
That's arsonists and bad forestry practices. That's not climate change.
Or set by governments as a means of entrapping us into climate change policy. I mean, this is the world we're living in.
So, David, is the problem we got trapped in a Chicken Little scenario where Trudeau, Guilbeault, whoever you want to pin it on, McKenna, were out of the gate too soon before we were really ready?
It's an impossible problem. They were starting late. They weren't starting early. It's an impossible problem politically.
But you can sell it if you stand by it. You can't wait. It's just like immigration. Can we agree that mass immigration is a brilliant idea for Canada? It's hard. It's hard to execute. It takes an active will and a bunch of supporting, framework of policies, but it's a brilliant idea. We're now right back to the same demographic problem we had before. It's looming, but you have to commit to these things, whether it's immigration or climate change. You do it in a half-assed way, and you've maybe made the problem worse because you've set back the whole public conversation on this subject. Immigration would be the same. Climate change, it's a disaster not to commit. And why not commit if you're in public office and you know your time is limited? Nobody's there forever. Just do what's right.
I agree.
I think the mistake the Trudeau government made on this was assuming that people would make sacrifices or would consider it worth investing in this. I think Biden was right, which is just take all the sacrifice out of it and just blow your brains out at the fiscal level and get the stuff done, because people won't make the sacrifice. Hey, before we run out of time, I want to have a kind of a fun conversation with you, and you're the two really only people I would be comfortable having this conversation with, and that's about Mark Carney. I remain skeptical that Trudeau is going to run in the next election. I think it's still quite plausible that there will be a Liberal leadership between now and the next election, just because Trudeau's falling further and further behind every week. He's not making up ground. He's now more than 20 points down. And I just assume, based on my experience in politics, that at some point he's going to say, I'm not going to go through that wood chipper, maybe very late in the day. So one of the names that kicks around is Carney. And I know him pretty well, but you guys both know him very well, and you've covered him. You've covered him in a number of different capacities, and you've covered politicians. So I kind of want to ask you, and I'll start with you, Amanda, what would he bring to Canadian politics if he were to, say, be the leader of the Liberal Party?
I mean, I think there's a sense, my view would be he would bring potentially the big tent liberal policy back. He would bring a liberalism that conservatives could ascribe to. So he might actually have a real shot at a majority, which is, as you know, harder and harder in this country. So I like that about him, and any other candidate that can actually appeal to a broader base. I think he has that. He has obviously the chops on sort of the fiscal financial side. He knows what he's doing. He's been inside the bank. He's been inside finance. There's something very reassuring about that. And he's personally very charismatic. So people differ on this. I've heard people say, he's not electable. I disagree with that. I think he's very relatable. I think he's a human first, and even though he's moved and moves in rarefied circles, I think he could be very relatable. My bigger question, David, is whether he's got the stomach for it, because the game gets uglier. You've seen it. I've seen it over the last 30, 40 years. It's not.
Your dad would have hated politics right now.
I'm not sure he would have. I'm not sure he would have been elected. Times are different, and people are looking for different things. And anyway, it's a kind of a harder. I don't know if you've ever. Every time I interview a cabinet minister, and then they would tweet about it, and they'd at me, and so I could see the horrifying things that get said to these people who are just trying to do their jobs. They're, all of them well-intentioned. Nobody in our government ever on either side of the aisle is evil or malevolent, or, they're doing their best, folks. And the feedback they get is awful. So I don't know if Mark Carney, having not had to deal with that ever yet in his life, appreciates how that would go. But right. I know a lot of people would be excited about it.
Kevin, what's your take?
I think a lot of people would be excited about it too. I was invited to do an investment house invited me to come and talk to them about Canada. And this question came up, would if Mark Carney became Liberal leader, would that make a difference? And I was ready for a lot of their questions. I wasn't quite ready for that one. I didn't have a good answer. I'm not sure I still have one. But I guess I came to think on the spot there, and I haven't changed my mind since, that I think it would make a difference to a great extent. I think certainly all the Bay Street types and business leaders who've piled on to the Poilievre campaign. If you watch Politico, you see their names and all the various Bay Street fundraisers that Poilievre is doing. I think they would certainly have second thoughts suddenly, because I don't doubt they're particularly comfortable with Poilievre, and not only because of the way he treats them publicly, but because what's he really offering? Like, he hasn't told us, right? So I think this is a group of people that wants to know what's behind the slogan. Carney, certainly, that there's a lot more there than slogans. We know what he's about. We know what he thinks. We know he's a serious guy. We know all of his talent. It would be a chance to change the channel for sure. Like, it would be a return to seriousness, I think, if Mark Carney became Liberal leader. And went up against a politician like Poilievre, or at least the Poilievre we've seen over the last couple of years. Presumably they continue down that path and he doesn't shapeshift into something else. That would be an interesting contest, and would give Canadians certainly a choice of the kind of government that they wanted. One run by, someone serious, someone who cares about policy, and someone who just wants to be a channel for all our frustrations and anger of what's gone on for the last couple of years.
I would add one thing, Kevin. I think you'll agree that the tone in Ottawa has been decidedly anti-business, and that's even in the context of how strangely anti-business Canadians at large, but politicians can be. It's bizarre to me that people take this approach to the very fundamental workings of all of our lives. I don't think Mark Carney would bring that, and I think that would be very refreshing. I mean, Poilievre thought it was in his interest to say he won't even meet with people on Bay Street. That's shocking. People should be shocked by that, and yet it resonates somehow. So if we could actually open up the check, it doesn't mean everybody gets in bed together and bad things happen, folks. It actually means policymakers understand what business leaders need, and when I say business leaders, I mean, the mom and pop guys matter as well. The GST holiday, you should pick up the phone and say, what do you think of this? They'll tell you in a hurry if it's a good idea or not. And that stuff matters.
Yeah, look, Carney got a good warm up for so things are bad out there right now. There's no question about that for any sort of public official. It wasn't easy for a public official in the UK when Carney was running the Bank of England, right?
Brexit,
and probably even harder than anything he might face. Certainly,
that's a good point.
On Parliament Hill. So he's been warmed up a bit. He's taken some tough shots. And Amanda talked about his charisma. It's a thing. It's real. I mean, you go everywhere you go. When you're talking to somebody who has been in Carney's orbit in some other location, like people want to know what's going on with him. Have you seen Mark? What's he doing now? Do you think he's going to run? And that's because he has that effect on people.
He's a natural leader. He's a natural leader.
And he cares. He might want, why is he? So a question I get a lot is like, why would he do it? Why wouldn't he just you've got some of the best jobs in the world right now, amazing platform.
He left Goldman Sachs to be an assistant deputy administrator of finance. He's interested in public service.
He absolutely.
And can I give you the answer that Kevin O'Leary gave when he called me up to say he was going to run for the Conservative leadership? And I said, dude, this is not going to be fun. You do not want to do this. He said, and I'm quoting, Amanda, it's not that often you get the shot at being the leader of a G7 country. And that's true. Mark Carney will do it because it's legacy making. It's big. Yeah. It's important.
He's got ambition, and that's one thing that he hasn't done yet. So that's that's obviously something that's driving him. But his desire to serve is also in that mix. So which is the most important? I don't know. I don't know him well enough to know, and I've never asked him directly, like, why you're really doing this, or why you're interested, or why you sort of hanging around long enough to see if a door opens for you. I don't know what the ultimate driver is, but I certainly know that the opportunity to serve is part of it for sure.
Incidentally, we should all remember that Mark Carney, when he was the governor of the Bank of England, made one of the most important changes, I think, historically ever, to the path to climate change mitigation, which was insisting that insurance companies actually account for the value of the risk. Because insurance companies are the most important underpinning of our economies, and they've started to do that. And that little change he made back in, I don't know, when was that, 2016 maybe, it has been one of the most fundamental changes in how businesses think about climate change, and it's super important. So as somebody who's made massive policy differences, you put him at the top of the list, in my view.
Great. Thank you so much, you guys. What a great conversation. I love sitting around with two friends and just shooting the shit about stuff and learning from you. It's a real privilege for me, actually, to be able to talk to you about this. So thank you.
It's only been an hour or so. We could go full Joe Rogan, David, and do this all afternoon if you want.
We have not tested our audience's patience yet with a full Joe Rogan 3-hour show, but
I don't know if you want to start with this subject on that.
No, that's right. But I think the three of us could pull it off, so we'll consider that. Anyway, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN and Fidelity Investments Canada, and all you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened to the show. Thanks very much. Thank Kevin and Amanda, and we'll be back next week, and it'll be almost as exciting as this, but probably not quite. See you then.